The storm didn't just fall over High Mesquite Valley that night. It came down like molten iron, iron, hammering the earth until the whole desert groaned beneath it. Jonah Hale reined in his horse when he spotted the overturned wagon, its wheels split open like a broken bone, steaming under the rain. And then he saw her. A lone Apache woman knelt beside a motionless body, her braids heavy with water, her hands trembling as if the storm had torn something out of her. When she lifted her face toward him, lightning carved her grief into something unforgettable. "I'm all alone now," she whispered. For a man who had spent years outrunning his own ghosts, Jonah felt something strike deep, something that made him dismount, even though every instinct begged him to ride on. Dawn crept slowly over High Mesquite Valley, dragging pale silver across the soaked desert, as if the storm had scraped every color from the land. The mesquite trees still dripped, their branches smelling of wet smoke. Mud clung to Jonah Hale's boots as he stepped away from the ruined wagon, the cold morning air cutting through the lingering heat of the night before. A distant coyote cried somewhere beyond the low ridges, its voice thin, almost mournful, as though it sensed the death the storm had left behind. This corner of Arizona territory had always been a place caught between worlds. Ranchers pushing for more land, drifters moving with the cattle seasons, and Apache families who had lived with the desert long before fences scarred it. Folks spoke soft when certain names were mentioned. Folks judged loudly when people didn't look like them. That truth hung in the valley like dust that never settled. Sahale stood a little apart from Jonah, her silhouette framed by a strip of bruised pink sky. Her pale buckskin dress clung to her legs, darkened by rain and dirt. Her long black hair, once neatly braided, fell in damp strands around her shoulders. Even covered in mud, she carried a quiet dignity, chin lifted, spine unbroken. Though grief weighed heavy on her features, her eyes, dark and watchful, flickered with something Jonah couldn't name. Strength, maybe? Defiance, maybe, or simply a heart refusing to collapse, even after the world had taken everything. The storm hadn't softened her. It had revealed her. Jonah pretended not to glance at her too often, but he kept catching himself doing exactly that. He noted the small piece of hammered iron she clutched in her left hand like a talisman. He didn't ask about it. The desert taught every man when to speak and when silence was the kinder choice. He adjusted his coat, feeling the familiar pull of the old scar along his ribs, a wound earned in a night he didn't talk about. Years of drifting from ranch to ranch had carved his body into lean muscle, the kind built from long rides, rough weather, and work done without complaint. His jaw carried the shadow of a beard, his eyes the hollow tiredness of a man who hadn't slept well in years. People met him and always said the same thing. Jonah Hale looked like someone who stayed only as long as he needed to, then moved on before the world asked anything of him. But this morning, something in him felt less sure of that. The valley smelled of wet clay and morning chill. Smoke rose from the wagon's broken lantern, mixing with the sharp scent of iron. Overhead, the clouds rolled apart just enough for the sun to slip through, casting a soft glow on the two figures standing there. One cowboy who had nowhere to belong, and one woman whose world had been washed away in a single night. Jonah cleared his throat, not trusting his voice. Sahale didn't look at him, but he could see her breath tremble in the cold air. They were strangers bound by storm, by death, and by a silence neither of them knew how to break. And yet, as the valley stretched open beneath the lifting sky, Jonah felt the faintest shift inside him, like a door easing open, letting in a sliver of light he wasn't ready for. The wind gnawed at the valley long after the storm had passed, scraping across the flats as Jonah led Sahale toward the nearest line shack. His horse snorted, uneasy with every gust that rattled the yucca stalks. The horizon glimmered with puddles reflecting a washed-out sky. But the chill clinging to the air told Jonah the night would drop its weight heavy and merciless. No one survived alone out here, not a cowboy, and certainly not a grieving Apache woman who had lost her horse, her shelter, and her father in one blow. The shack came into view as a squat shadow perched against a low ridge, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Jonah pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped aside so Sahale could enter first. Dust rose in a tired sigh when she crossed the threshold. Inside, everything smelled of old wood, forgotten coffee, and the faint echo of men who had passed through seasons before them. Saheli stood just inside the doorway, not moving, her eyes sweeping the room with the caution of someone taught never to assume safety. "You can take the cot," Jonah said quietly. "Floor's dry enough for me." She didn't answer, didn't even seem to breathe, only watched him with a stillness that made the room feel smaller. Jonah busied himself with the stove, striking a match with numb fingers. Sparks caught slowly, coaxing a weak flame into life. The small glow softened the harsh angles of the room, and for a moment, even the shadow seemed to step back. Saheli removed her soaked blanket and hesitated. "Turn away," she murmured. Jonah did without a word. He listened to the soft, dragging sound of wet buckskin peeled from skin, the rustle of fabric being wrung out. The fire cracked, throwing warmth against his shoulders. Only when she said, "You may look," did he turn back. She was wrapped now in an old wool blanket pulled from a cedar chest, her damp hair darkening the fabric. The blanket swallowed her frame, but her eyes, sharp, watchful, remained steady. She held the small iron talisman in her hand, her thumb brushing its curved edge over and over, as though grounding herself. Jonah gestured toward the stove. "It'll warm soon." Her gaze flicked to the flames. "It's enough." Silence fell, the kind that pressed against the ears. Jonah sat on the floor near the door, stretching his legs, rubbing his palms together against the lingering cold. Saheli lowered herself onto the cot, but she didn't lie down. She stayed sitting, knees drawn close, her fingers wrapped around that piece of iron, as if it were the last familiar thing she had left in the world. Jonah cleared his throat, unsure why he felt the need to fill the quiet. "Storm like that don't come often. Lucky we found shelter." Her head lifted slightly. "Not luck." "What then?" She hesitated, then replied, "My father used to say, the land chooses who survives it." Jonah didn't know how to respond. He'd survived enough nights in the desert to suspect she might be right. Another stretch of quiet settled between them, broken only by the whine of wind slipping through the window frame. Jonah found himself studying her face, its angles softened by exhaustion, yet held firm by a will he did not understand. She was tired, grieving, drenched in sorrow, but she did not fold. He respected that more than he could say. "Back there," he said at last, "when you told me you were alone, I'm sorry you had to say it." Her eyes flicked toward him, unreadable. The storm took what was left. "I spoke only truth." He nodded, feeling an unexpected ache move through his chest. "You don't have to speak it again tonight." A faint shift crossed her expression, something like surprise, something like relief, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She looked back into the fire, letting its light draw shadows under her lashes. Jonah leaned his head against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. He wasn't sure when he had last shared a room with someone without feeling trapped. Strangely, the quiet presence of the woman on the cot didn't suffocate him. If anything, it kept the ghosts away. Outside, the desert wind circled the shack, rattling the loose boards and carrying the distant cry of nightbirds. Inside, two strangers sat in uneasy peace, their pasts unspoken, their futures uncertain, bound only by the thin walls of an old shack and the fragile thread of a night that had brought them together. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the first moment that their lives began to turn toward one another. Cross Creek Ranch rose from the valley like a promise. Weather-worn fences, the low barn darkened by years of sun, and a wide porch where Martha Cross liked to hang laundry that snapped like white flags in the breeze. By the time Jonah and Saheli arrived, the storm clouds had drifted off toward the mountains, leaving behind a washed, almost tender quiet over the land. The ranch dogs barked in greeting before falling strangely still, as if sensing the gravity of the two soaked figures approaching. Martha Cross stepped out first, hands on her hips, apron dusted with flour. Her eyes widened at the sight of Saheli, at the mud on her dress, the exhaustion on her face, the grief she carried like a second skin. But Martha's voice held no fear, no judgment, only warmth. "Come in, child," she said. "Storm like that shouldn't leave anyone outside." Ephraim Cross appeared behind her, broad-shouldered, beard silvered with age. He clapped Jonah on the arm, without asking why he'd shown up with a stranger. Jonah had slept in the cross bunkhouse enough times to know Ephraim never asked unnecessary questions. "Plenty of room here," Ephraim said simply. "Get her warm." The simplicity of their welcome seemed to disarm Sahaley more than any kindness Jonah had offered. She hesitated a moment too long before following Martha inside, her hand lingering on the doorframe, as though she feared the moment she entered she'd owe these people more than she had left to give. Jonah watched her disappear into the kitchen, then carried his saddle and gear toward the bunkhouse. Yet something tugged at him, an unfamiliar urge to stay close, to make sure Sahaley didn't vanish the moment he turned his back. The days that followed settled over the ranch like soft dust. Sahaley helped Martha grind corn, mend clothes, and fetch water from the well. Her movements were quiet but steady, each action deliberate, as if doing work kept her upright when her heart threatened to pull her under. Martha spoke to her gently, filling silences without forcing conversation. Slowly, Sahaley began offering small responses, soft yeses, small nods, rare smiles that lifted the corner of her mouth like ripples on still water. Jonah worked the north pasture with Ephraim, tightening fence lines that the storm had battered. He told himself he was too busy to notice every time Sahaley stepped out to shake crumbs from a towel or hang herbs to dry. But his eyes kept drifting toward the house anyway, tracing the line of her shoulders, the fall of her hair, the way she stood with her weight slightly shoved in a warrior's balance, even in rest. One afternoon, Jonah found her behind the barn, kneeling beside a colt whose hind leg trembled with pain. A coil of bent wire lay in the dust. Sahaley stroked the colt's neck, whispering something in Apache, the words low and soothing. The animal, which had been fighting Ephraim all morning, stilled under her touch. Jonah approached slowly. "He's been kicking at that wire an hour," he said. "Didn't let a soul near him." "He is afraid," Sahaley replied without looking up. "Fear makes even gentle creatures forget themselves." Her fingers brushed the colt's flank. Jonah crouched beside her, working the wire loose with careful hands. When the final twist came free, the colt jerked once, then settled again under Sahaley's palm. Jonah found himself staring at her, at the calm strength in her face, at the fierce tenderness she seemed to possess without effort. "You've got the touch," he murmured. Sahaley looked at him then, truly looked, and for a moment Jonah felt as though she saw past his skin, past his calluses and weather-worn clothes, right into the part of him he kept locked away. "It is not touch," she said softly. "It is trust." The words hung between them, warmer than the sun that beat down on the barn roof. That evening, Martha asked Sahaley to bring Jonah a mug of coffee out to the porch. The sky burned orange as the sun lowered behind the mesquite-dotted ridges. Jonah sat sharpening his knife until Sahaley approached, her footsteps light on the wooden boards. She held out the mug without a word. He took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest instant, and something passed between them, something quiet but undeniable. They stood side by side, watching the sky shift through shades of gold, copper, then violet. When Sahaley finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father taught me that people remember everything," she said, "even what they wish they could forget." Jonah's hand tightened around the mug. He didn't dare look at her. "Memories can be stubborn, pain more so." He exhaled slowly. "You're not wrong." The crickets began their evening song, filling the air with a soft tremor. Jonah felt a strange ache growing in his chest, a longing he hadn't felt in years, not just for company, but for peace, for stillness beside someone who understood the weight of silence. A few days later, as dusk pulled across the valley, Jonah found Sahaley standing by the fence that bordered the pasture. Her hair caught the dying light, glowing faintly like a black feather dipped in gold. He walked up beside her, not sure why his voice felt tight when he spoke. "I used to fear nights like this," he admitted. "Back when, before everything fell apart." She shifted her gaze toward him. "It is the dark you fear, or what hides inside it?" Jonah swallowed. "What it reminds me of." Sahaley turned to face him fully. She reached up and lightly touched the faint white scar along his jaw, a careful, feather-soft gesture that stole his breath. "Pain shapes us," she said, "but it doesn't have to own us." Jonah didn't move, didn't breathe. That small touch felt like a hand pressed to a wound he'd carried too long, reminding it that healing was still possible. They stood together until the sky went black and the first stars blinked awake over High Mesquite Valley. No promises were spoken, no confessions made. Yet something had shifted with the quiet certainty of roots taking hold in softened earth. Whatever bound them now was no longer accident or circumstance. It was choice, unspoken, fragile, beginning to grow. Summer heat rolled into High Mesquite Valley in a slow, breathless wave, the kind that made every board on the ranch house creak and every horse flick its tail in irritation. Jonah felt the shift in the air long before the sun dipped toward evening. Some part of him, an instinct honed by years of drifting, knew peace never lingered long out here. Not when a woman like Sahaley carried a truth dangerous enough to draw men back from the dead. Sheriff Josiah Cook arrived coated in dust, his horse lathered and trembling. Jonah saw his expression before the man even spoke, and his stomach tightened. "Maddox is back into the valley," Cook said, swinging down from his saddle, voice low and urgent. "He's asking after an Apache woman traveling with a cowboy. That's the only description he needs." Ephraim swore under his breath. Martha pressed a hand to her apron. Sahaley stood near the porch steps, still as carved stone, her fingers curling subtly around the edge of the railing. Jonah stepped toward Cook. "You sure it's him?" "As sure as the Lord above." Cook's eyes softened. "They won't let her live if they find her." The world tilted slightly, not because Jonah doubted the danger, but because he suddenly imagined Sahaley's absence as something too large, too dark, too similar to the hole left in him the night his own family vanished. A fear older than memory stirred inside him. He looked at Sahel. She met his gaze with steady, unblinking calm. "I won't run," she said. "You might have to," Jonah replied, fighting the tremor in his chest. "No, I'm tired of running." The certainty in her voice shook him. She deserved safety, deserved more than the restless, uncertain life he himself had barely survived all these years. Yet she stood with her shoulders straight, like a tree that refused to bow to any wind. Cook touched the brim of his hat. "I'll ride for backup, but keep low tonight." When the sheriff disappeared down the road, an eerie stillness settled over Cross Creek Ranch. Long shadows stretched across the fields. The sky dimmed from gold to purpling dusk. The air grew heavy, as though the valley itself braced for something it couldn't name. Jonah checked every window latch, every door bolt, every rifle. Ephraim gathered the ranch hands. Martha coaxed Sahaley into the kitchen, though Sahaley's eyes stayed fixed on the darkening ridge beyond the fields. Night crept in. Then came the first sound, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, slow, controlled, hunted. Jonah felt his blood go cold. He stepped out onto the porch with his rifle slung across his chest. Lightning flashed far off, illuminating 5 riders cresting the ridge like silhouettes carved from stormlight. Maddox rode in front, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, lantern light glinting off the knife strapped across his chest. "Get inside," Jonah said to Sahaley, his voice sharper than he intended. She didn't move. "I stay." Jonah turned to her then, reins starting to patter on the porch roof. "Sahaley!" "I stay," she repeated, quieter this time, but unmovable. "You told me I did not have to speak my truth again. I will not flee from it either." He wanted to argue, wanted to drag her inside, bolt the door, shield her from the world. But the resolve in her eyes was stronger than any storm he had ever ridden through. Thunder rolled across the valley as Maddox and his men dismounted, lanterns casting long streaks of fire across the wet ground. Jonah moved down the steps, positioning himself between the barn and the house, where he could see every shadow. "Come out easy, cowboy," Maddox called. His voice slithered across the yard like a threat too familiar to ignore. "We're looking for the Apache girl. You hand her over, we'll be on our way." Lightning cracked. Rain began to fall. Jonah didn't hesitate. "You'll get her over my dead body." A moment of silence. Then Maddox's laugh cut through the night. "That can be arranged." Gunfire erupted, sharp, violent, echoing across the valley. Jonah fired back, pressing himself against the corral fence as a bullet splintered wood near his head. Ephraim and the ranch hands held their ground at the barn, returning fire with grim determination. The storm arrived in full fury, rain slashing sideways, washing the world into streaks of silver and shadow. Through the chaos, Jonah saw Maddox slipping toward the house, using the smoke and rain as cover. Jonah knew where he was headed, the kitchen window, where Sahale would be helping Martha. No, Jonah breathed and sprinted, mud sucking at his boots, thunder drowning his breath. He rounded the corner just as Maddox smashed the window frame with his boot, shards flying. Sahale gasped and stumbled back. Jonah tackled Maddox, driving him into the mud. They rolled, fists and boots striking hard, breath tearing out of them as the storm howled overhead. Maddox's knife flashed. Jonah grabbed his wrist, but the blade came closer, closer, the cold edge grazing Jonah's throat, a whisper away from ending everything. I should have finished you on the trail, Maddox snarled. Jonah's strength faltered, mud slicked his grip, the knife pressed harder, and then thunder inside the thunder. A gunshot split the night. Maddox jerked, eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest. He collapsed into the waterlogged dirt. Jonah staggered back, breath ragged. Sahale stood in the shattered window, both hands trembling around the smoking shotgun, rain plastering her hair to her face, but her eyes never left Jonah. For a long moment, the storm fell silent in his ears. It was just her, alive, fierce, unbroken. I thought I'd lost you, he said. The words ripped from a place inside him he hadn't let anyone touch in years. Sahale lowered the gun slowly. You are not lost, she whispered. Not to me. Around them, the battle dissolved. Maddox's men fled into the darkness. Ephraim shouted something triumphant, but Jonah heard none of it. All he saw was Sahale, framed by broken glass and rain, choosing him in the moment it mattered most. And somehow, through the fear and the blood and the storm, Jonah Hale realized he wasn't running anymore. He had someone and somewhere to stay for. Rain softened into a mist by the time the last echoes of gunfire faded across High Mesquite Valley. The barn smoldered at its edges, the earth churned and dark where boots had slipped and bullets had fallen. But the danger was gone. Only breath, unsteady, living breath, remained. Jonah sat on an overturned water trough near the well, mud streaking his shirt, blood, mostly not his, drying against his skin. The cut along his shoulder throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He didn't care. Pain was a small thing tonight. He had felt far worse. Sahale approached with a basin of warm water Martha had hurried to heat. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though she feared Jonah might vanish if she reached him too quickly. The storm smoke smell lingered in her hair. Shadows from the lantern behind her flickered across her cheeks, softening the trembling resolve still etched into them. Sit still, she murmured. Jonah didn't argue. He watched her kneel before him, watched her dip the cloth into the water, watched her squeeze out the excess, as though the world depended on the steadiness of her hands. When she pressed the cloth to his shoulder, warmth bloomed through the ache. You saved my life, he said quietly. She shook her head. You risked yours for mine. That's different. Her eyes lifted. No, it is the same. The cloth slowed, resting against his skin. Jonah felt the full weight of her gaze then, dark, steady, unflinching. Something inside him seemed to shift, realign, as if he were finally being seen in a way he had not been since he was a boy. You could have run, he whispered. No one would have blamed you. Sahale dipped the cloth again, her reflection trembling in the water. My father said iron must meet fire before it becomes strong. She wrung the cloth, not looking at him. I have met my fire. Running would not have saved me. Jonah exhaled, the breath shaking loose from somewhere deep in his chest. I keep thinking about that night, the night my family was taken. I spent years believing if I stayed still too long, the dark would swallow me next. Sahale rose slowly and sat beside him on the trough. She didn't reach for his hand, just let her arm brush his, a touch so gentle it struck him harder than any blow. You survived the dark, she said, but you never learned to rest in the light. His throat tightened. And you lost everything in one night. How are you not falling apart? Sahale looked toward the hills where the storm had receded. Because falling apart would mean I have nothing left to protect. She turned back to him. I still have my father's teachings. I have the land. I have breath. Her voice wavered then, barely a crack that revealed the wound beneath. And I have the choice not to be alone anymore. Jonah's breath stalled. The desert felt impossibly quiet, as if the land itself listened. He forced himself to speak, his voice low. If you stay here a while, no one at Cross Creek will turn you out. Martha would sooner fight off a whole army. Sahaley studied him, eyes softening at the edges. And you, would you want me to stay? Jonah swallowed hard. Words had never come easy to him, not the ones that mattered, so he spoke the only truth he could shape. I don't remember the last time I wanted anyone to stay. A silence followed, deep and tender. Then Sahel did what she had not done since he met her. She reached for his hand, her fingers slipping into his with quiet certainty, roughened palms against roughened palms, two lives marked by loss finding a single point of rest. You are not lost, Jonah Hale, she whispered. Not anymore. He closed his hand around hers, feeling the truth of her words settle in his bones like warmth after a long winter. For the first time in years, the valley didn't feel empty. The night didn't feel threatening. The shadows felt like shelter instead of danger. Behind them, the ranch bustled with low voices and the clatter of buckets as Ephraim and the hands tended to the damage. But here by the well, under the soft lantern glow, Jonah and Sahaley sat in a quiet world of their own, one held together by breath, by touch, by something neither of them dared to name aloud yet. And though the storm clouds drifted away into the night, something new had begun to root itself in the softened earth beneath their feet. Autumn slipped quietly into High Mesquite Valley, cooling the air and turning the mesquite leaves brittle around the edges. The scars of the attack at Cross Creek had faded into repaired boards and new fence posts. But for Jonah and Sahaley, the deeper healing had begun long before the ranch was whole again. Jonah spent the next months working from dawn until the moon rose, hauling lumber, gathering stone, repairing tools, taking every small job Ephraim offered, and seeking more in the neighboring homesteads. He saved every dollar, every coin, refusing to touch a cent until he'd scraped together enough to buy a small, abandoned cabin at the edge of Dry Creek. It stood crooked and half swallowed by weeds, its roof missing more shingles than it kept. But when Jonah looked at it, he saw not ruin, but possibility. And when he brought Sahel to see it, fingers nervous at the brim of his hat, she smiled in a way that loosened something tight in his chest. They rebuilt it together. Sahel cleared the brush around the cabin, her hands steady as she cut away the dead roots crowding the walls. Jonah repaired the roof, his hammer ringing out across the quiet creek bed like a promise taking shape. Sometimes Martha sent the ranch hands over to help. Sometimes Sahaley worked alone when Jonah had to ride out for supplies. Days layered on days, and the cabin slowly rose into a home. Its boards straightened, its porch sturdy, its windows washed until the desert sun spilled clean and warm through the glass. One morning, when the last of the repairs neared completion, Sahaley hung a string of turquoise beads above the doorway. The stones glimmered a soft blue, catching the light with each breeze. Jonah stood beside her, watching the beads sway. "What does it mean?" he asked. She touched one of the stones gently. Protection, memory, and a promise that a home should be made with intention, not accident. Jonah swallowed the simple truth of her words settling deep inside him. "Does it feel like home to you?" Her eyes softened. It could. That answer was more than enough. Weeks later, when everything was finally in place, Jonah saddled his horse and asked Sahaley to ride with him to her father's grave. The air was crisp, the sky stretched wide and blue as hammered steel. They rode along Red Wash Road until the creek bed curved into a quiet hollow, where wild sunflowers still grew stubbornly despite the season. The small mound of stones lay just as they had left it, weathered but unbroken. Sahaley knelt first, brushing fallen leaves away from the ground. Jonah stood beside her, holding a bundle wrapped in canvas. When he unrolled it, Sahaley drew in a soft breath. It was the iron talisman, reshaped, no longer the bent, broken hook she had carried on the storm-lashed night they met, but a small, beautifully forged crescent, smooth and whole beneath the morning sun. Jonah had spent weeks learning from a local blacksmith, burning his hands more times than he would admit, until he could shape the metal into something that held both memory and renewal. "It's the same iron," Jonah said quietly, "just given another chance." Sahaley's fingers trembled as she touched it. She whispered something in Apache, soft, rhythmic, rising like smoke into the air. A prayer of farewell. a thank you. When she stood, Jonah took her hand. There was no hesitation now, no fear, only certainty. This land, he said, nodding toward the valley, toward the cabin, waiting for them, toward the light warming the stones at their feet. It's ours now, if you want it to be. Sahel turned toward him. Her eyes, once shadowed by grief, now held the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and come out shaped but unbroken. She lifted his hand to her cheek. We're forged, Jonah, she said. You and I. The words settled between them like the final stroke of a hammer sealing metal to metal. The wind rose, rustling the mesquite leaves, carrying the scent of dry earth and a future untouched by fear. Below them, Dry Creek shimmered with early light, and on its bank stood their small cabin, smoke beginning to curl from the chimney, thin, steady, a living line against the sky. As they rode back toward it, the valley stretched open before them. Not harsh, not empty, not something to outrun, but a home built by choice, shaped by courage, and filled with a love born from storm and fire. The story of Jonah Hale and Sahel in High Mesquite Valley delivers a poignant life lesson. Healing and love emerge when we choose to stand with someone through their darkest moments, forging bonds stronger than any storm. Jonah, a drifter haunted by loss, could have ridden past Sahel's grief-stricken cry, preserving his solitary existence. Yet her raw vulnerability and unyielding resolve drew him in, compelling him to stay. Their journey facing danger together, rebuilding a cabin, and reshaping a broken talisman, teaches us that connection is built through shared courage and quiet acts of trust, like tending wounds or standing firm against threats. Sahel's refusal to run and Jonah's choice to fight for her show that true strength lies in embracing vulnerability, not fleeing it. Their story, culminating in a home forged with intention, resonates deeply, urging us to reflect on moments we've chosen to stay for someone, even when fear beckoned us away. It reminds us that love is not an escape from pain, but a commitment to face it together, creating something enduring in a world that often feels fleeting. When have we chosen to stand? And what did it teach us about building a life worth keeping? If this tale stirred your heart, share your story in the comments. When have you stayed for someone, and how did it shape your path? Your voices breathe life into these Wild West narratives, weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to join our community for more soulful stories. Let's keep the fire of courage and connection burning together, inspiring us to live boldly and love fiercely.